So today we're going to tackle Marie Kondo and her KonMari method that's been so popular. And we'll take a look at how it might impact some ideas from early Buddhism, coming right up. I'm Doug Smith. I'm director of the Online Dharma Institute. That's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you would like to get a free mini course on understanding wisdom, kindness, and calm, check out onlinedharma.org, where I've got a free mini course up there that you can download and check on your own right now. So in this video, what I'm going to do is first we'll discuss Marie Kondo's method and what she had to say, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, and at least to give you my own take on it. And then at the end, we're going to look at some potential ways that Buddhism can, or early Buddhism, some ideas from early Buddhism can impact this kind of, her kind of take, her kind of approach. Because, well, I just did a recent video on minimalism. And we saw, I think in that video, that minimalism has a lot of similarities to some ideas from Buddhism in general and early Buddhism in particular. And I think it's not too exaggerated to say that Marie Kondo's approach is in some ways the most popular form of minimalism around nowadays, in the sense that the minimalist enterprise is one of paring down our lives to what is most important, and in particular paring down the things that we own, the things that we have around us, the inanimate objects in our life, paring them down to the few and most important. And that is kind of the heart of what Marie Kondo wants us to do with her ideas about tidying up. I mean, it sounds strange, but she really does make a lot out of it. Now, what I'm going to be talking about nowadays, or at least on this video, is based on her book, her most recent book, or I should say her first book. It's called, I think, the Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, or something like that. I'll put a picture of it up here on the screen, and also a talk that she gave to Google a while back, which is up on YouTube, and I'll put a link to that down below, as well as a link to her book in case you want to take a look at it. I'm enough of a minimalist, in quotes, that I actually don't have a Netflix account. I've been told that she has a very, very popular show on Netflix where she goes around to people's houses and does her Marie Kondo or KonMari method in cleaning up people's houses and making a difference in their lives. I haven't seen the show, so I really can't speak to that. So the basis I think of Marie Kondo's approach is similar to the ones that we saw before about minimalism. That our capitalist kind of consumerist lifestyle tends to lead to a sort of a syndrome of hoarding or clutter in our houses, where we buy and own and receive too much, more than we have place for in our lives. And I think one very simple kind of rejoinder to Marie Kondo's approach is to say that this is only a problem of the wealthy. It's sort of like a first world problem. And of course, there is a lot of truth to that, where we can say that there are a lot of people who don't have the funds to be able to purchase or receive from others who are perhaps wealthy as well, to receive or purchase things that they can put in their houses and clutter them up with. But I don't think that that's entirely fair, because problems of clutter, problems of hoarding are really becoming endemic in the United States, at least, to a large degree. And I expect in much of the first world, even with people who are not particularly wealthy. I know myself that I'm not a hoarder by any means, but I certainly do have a problem with clutter in my house, and of not throwing things away, which goes hand in hand. No matter how much money you have, no matter whether you're wealthy or not, we all get stuff in our lives from one place or another and have to eventually decide whether or not to dispose of them. And there's a large, I think, human tendency to cling to things in our lives that we've received simply because we've received them. And the heart of Marie Kondo's method is basically a very rigorous approach, a very rigorous, one time in your life practice of decluttering. That's what she claims. What she claims is with her Marie Kondo or KonMari method, that what you're going to do is basically you're going to organize the things that you have in your house by categories. And you're going to decide in that category, you're going to go through that category, let's say all of the clothing that you have, and go through it one by one. First, you're going to take all the clothing in your house and put it in a pile. And I think that seems particularly extreme, but the point here is, in a certain way, to help minimize the amount of attachment we have for the things. When they're sitting in a closet or in our chest of drawers, there's more of an attachment to them there. There's more of a sense of letting leave be where they are. Whereas if you take them out of there and sort of pile them together, then you're already beginning the process of getting rid of them to an extent. And then you're supposed to take them one by one in your hands and decide if they, in her words, spark joy. That's the phrase that she uses. If they spark joy. And you should be able to tell that immediately by holding them, is the idea. And if they don't, which of course most of the things in our lives won't, then you're supposed to discard them. Now there are going to be a small number of necessary things in our lives, say toothbrushes and so on, that may not spark joy, but that we literally need. And she says for those, that you are supposed to sort of at least attempt to make them spark joy. Those are the few things in your life that you're actually supposed to sort of actively attempt to make feel joyful towards them, because you're going to want to have to keep them. But other than those very few things that you actually literally need, everything else goes by this very rigorous kind of culling process. And as she says, most things don't spark joy that we have around us. Most, and here we're going to see some very close echoes to the teachings of Buddhism in general, early Buddhism in particular. Most of the things we own or that we keep around us, we do out of attachment. That is, attachment to our own past, to our history, or a kind of a worry about our future. In the attachment to the past, there's this idea that since we're attached to certain things in our own memories, then the feeling is that the objects associated with those things, we sort of have to grab onto them, or else we're going to somehow lose our memory of the event that we went through. And her, I think, wise counsel there is that we don't need the object to have the memory. The memory is good by itself. The object only becomes clutter after a while. We never look at them. They remain in boxes almost universally. That is to say, most of the stuff that we're holding on to because of our past never really gets reopened and relooked at. Most of it doesn't actually spark joy, in her words. So it's best to discard those things, to, as it were, relax around them, relax around our attachment to them, and let them go. And if the memory is really good, the memory will remain without the object. Or she says we can even photograph them if we want, and at least have the photograph. I mean, that way, if there's some literal thing that we think we might forget, we'll have a photograph anyway, and the photograph, of course, doesn't take up any space. If it's a digital photograph, I mean. Now, I mean, in the future is the same thing. A lot of things we own around us and keep, we keep out of a kind of a worry that we might need them someday. And as I think she wisely says, the vast majority of these things we never will need. And although there are a small number of, say, documents, legal things maybe, that we actually do need or might need in the future, and of course those we should keep, the vast majority of these things, if we end up needing them again, the one time out of 100, we can always find it somewhere. We can buy it again. Of course, it's a small amount of expense, but given the amount that we're going to be expunging from our lives and easing our lives and reducing clutter, it's worth it to do that. That is to say, the worry is a kind of a clinging, and we should really learn to relax around that and let these things go. And then the other part of the method is that once you're finished this rigorous process of decluttering that we've talked about with all of the various things in your life, and you've pared everything down to a small group of things, all of which give you joy, spark joy in you, then you're supposed to basically find a place for everything, so that everything has its place in your home. And I think part of the reason for this is that it minimizes the chance that you're going to start cluttering again. Because the point is, everything has its place, and so anything new that you bring into the house basically has to displace something else. And so as a result, it tends to make the process remain into the future. At least, in other words, you don't have to do it again. Because she claims that you only have to do this once. She says it may take you 6 months that first time to get this decluttering process finished, but once it's finished, you shouldn't have to do it again in your life. I'm somewhat skeptical about that claim, but I certainly don't have any data on one way or the other, so I'll leave it to her to make that assertion, and you can make of it what you will. Now, the other, I think, critical part of her her approach to all of this process of decluttering is that she has a kind of a view of the objects in our lives as animate, as sentient. And although we can say that that's a kind of a fun metaphor for the things in our lives, she really does, at least in her first book, make more of it than a simple metaphor. She repeats it quite a few times and in different contexts. So she says that when she goes into somebody's house, she can feel the love that the house has for its inhabitants, that it wants them to be happy. That she says that with objects within each house, she says every object wants to make you happy. And so if it isn't making you happy, if it isn't sparking joy in you, that you should feel okay discarding it. She also says that when you discard things, they will find a way of coming back to you in larger amounts or in better amounts, in the sense of not being more clutter, but in the sense of being more useful. So there's a kind of almost an idea of rebirth with the things that you discard, that they die and then are reborn into your life. And a lot of this, there's a phrase that I know in English called the pathetic fallacy, which is this fallacy that inanimate objects have a life of their own. And of course, so many cartoons have made an enormous job out of the pathetic fallacy of making things in our lives come to life in this way, inanimate objects. But I think that's actually really a central part of her kind of approach, is to imbue the objects in our life with soul, with a kind of animate life of their own, in that they're trying to help us, we're trying to help them. She did spend, I think, 5 years of her life as a Shinto shrine maiden, and there's a certain amount of, I think, Shinto animism here as well. But I think by animating the insentient objects around us, these inanimate objects around it, by animating them with a sense of identity and purpose and feelings, we end up, I think, making more of them than they are. At least that is one danger, one potential danger. So while I think the thrust of Marie Kondo's approach is very minimalist in its heart of trying to pare down our lives to the more essential core, rather than getting lost in all of the clutter of our lives, which can, again, this process can be very useful. What it ends up doing, I think, potentially, is increasing attachment for those things that remain. Because those things that remain, we're not simply attached to them because they spark joy in us, but we're suggested to be attached to them because they literally are alive. They're literally part of our lives as other beings around us that have feelings and concerns for us, which I think may take things a little too far. It also pretty clearly ends up being an aesthetic, a kind of, we might say, Zen or Shinto or Japanese-inspired aesthetic of paring things down to a small number of highly aesthetic objects, at least objects that to us are highly aesthetic, in sparking joy in us, in perhaps being beautiful. Now, I would certainly not be the first to say that I love aesthetic things as well. I mean, I have some behind me, after all. So we're all very attached to aesthetic things, beautiful things, nice things, things that make us happy in our lives. And that's part of lay life. That's part of being a householder, at least in the early Buddhist understanding of these things. So we shouldn't push back on this too much. There is certainly a role for this. But there is a deeper problem here with this kind of valorization of sense pleasures, which is what it really is. Curating our lives down to a small number of very pleasurable sensations, if we like. Now, that's not to say that this can't be helpful, that her KonMari method can't be helpful to many people. In fact, I'm sure it can. As I say, I haven't seen the show, the Netflix show, but I have every reason to believe that paring things down and getting rid of clutter can be very useful in our lives as another form of minimalism. But there is, at least from the perspective of early Buddhism, a deeper problem here. So from the perspective of early Buddhism, the approach of Marie Kondo is a good first step, because it is indeed attempting to untangle us from a lot of the objects in our lives. But there's a deeper problem, which remains even after the method is completed. And I think to illustrate this problem that remains, I'll read a short passage where Ananda, who was the Buddha's close attendant during much of his life, talks with a householder named Tapusa. And the householder says to Ananda, he says, "Sir, Ananda, we are lay people who enjoy sensual pleasures. We like sensual pleasures. We love them and take joy in them. But renunciation seems like an abyss. I've heard that in this teaching and training there are very young mendicants whose minds are eager for renunciation. They're confident, settled, and decided about it. They see it as peaceful. Renunciation is a dividing line between the multitude and the mendicants in this teaching and training." So Tapusa here says we take joy in sense pleasures. I mean, this is almost the words that Marie Kondo herself uses. Find things that spark joy. And Tapusa is saying we find that joy in sense pleasures, and if we like, in things around us. He's, in a certain sense, coming right out of that method. But he says that there's another aspect to the practice, at least to early Buddhist practice, which is renunciation. And for Tapusa, renunciation is an abyss, as he says. It's an abyss. It's something very difficult. We see the importance in it in renouncing even those things that are pleasurable to us. But, I mean, he understands it, but he doesn't get it, if you like. So then after that, Tapusa and Ananda decide to go off to the Buddha to basically ask the Buddha for some advice. How should they approach this problem? Is there something that the Buddha can say? And so the Buddha listens, and the Buddha says that he agrees 100%. He says that when he was younger, he was in the same position. He also enjoyed sense pleasures and found joy in them. He also saw that renunciation and seclusion were good, but they were an abyss in a sense, that he couldn't overcome the problem that he preferred the sense pleasures. And even though he understood intellectually that renunciation was good, he didn't really see it entering his life. And he says, what was the thing that changed? What was the practice that changed? And the practice was to learn the drawbacks of sense pleasure. That was the practice that he found useful in this situation. So the upshot here, if we're looking at the KonMari method from an early Buddhist perspective, is that it's fine so far as it goes, but we need to attach to it practices to begin to see the drawbacks of sense pleasures in general. That is, after all, the first noble truth, that life is, in a sense, unsatisfactory. And what that means is that all of our sense pleasures, pleasurable though they may be, sparking joy though they may, they are unsatisfactory in some deep sense. And it's by coming to an awareness of that we begin to see the drawbacks. And we see the drawbacks through the fact that these things decay, that they do not last, that any sense pleasure that we may have is only temporary. That is, we need to begin to try to see the benefits of renunciation for its own sake, not as a curated sense, a smaller group of sense pleasures, although that may be a beginning, but perhaps to understand it as getting away from these sense pleasures altogether as a final resting place or as a final refuge, the way I think Marie Kondo tends to make it, that our houses become a sort of a refuge for us once we've curated them down to this smaller group of sense pleasures or of pleasurable objects. That is not to say that we want to become monastics, because I don't think most of us will, although some of us might, but rather that by at least practicing in this kind of vein, in this kind of direction, we can learn, I think, a wiser way of coming to terms with the objects in our life, rather than imbuing them with more importance than they really have. Let's say by imbuing them with sentience, where they're actually sort of other beings that are giving us a pleasure on their own side, we should understand it as we make them pleasurable by the way we see them, and that is fine, but the problem with that is that it leads to attachment. The question at the heart of all this is whether we can construct a life where we can have joy, where we can spark joy without needing to own things. Not that we won't own things, but that we can see a way of sparking joy without ownership, so that even if we lose the things that we own, we can still have joy. That, I think, is the overarching question here. So if these kinds of questions interest you, check out my mini course up on onlinedharma.org, the Online Dharma Institute. It's about a kindness and wisdom and calm that you can try to increase in your own life. Those are ways, I think, of trying to spark joy without ownership in particular. And if you're interested in helping to support the work I'm doing here on my YouTube channel, check out my Patreon page. It's linked down below. Consider subscribing, give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed the show, and I hope we'll catch you on the next video. Meanwhile, all of you, be well.